So, kia ora koutou. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Obviously, this was originally planned as a real life event, but just like we have made businesses pivot, politicians in waiting need to be able to do the same. And ultimately, we can't put democracy on hold waiting for a cure for COVID. We have to find other ways to get our messages across and connect with voters. And use of the internet is an amazing way, and we're so incredibly lucky that we have this technology so that I can still be here and speak with you this evening. So, thank you so much for joining and taking time out of your lives to come and listen to Top's ideas for New Zealand's future. Because why I'm here and why Top's here is because ultimately it's time for real change. We have to address the fundamental underlying issues our society is facing instead of either pretending they don't exist or throwing money at the symptoms. And that's really all we have had for 30 years with this red blue rewind. TOP's real focus is on the systemic issues. We are absolutely fed up of the same old tinkering, but not a lot is actually changing. So a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, I should have said at the beginning, I am the deputy leader of TOP and the candidate for the North Shore. And so my background's in law. I did civil litigation and Crown prosecution. I was a lawyer for 7 years. And it was really working in the criminal justice system gives you a unique insight into what's really going on out there in society and how difficult life is for so many people. And while I was in that job, I was there whilst National was in charge and still there when Labor came along. And I can tell you that nothing about my job as a prosecutor changed, whether it was red or blue. Because ultimately, you can tinker around with the system itself, but that does nothing if you are not addressing these systemic issues out there in society that are sending people into the system in the first place. And that is where we need to focus our attention if we actually want to see change. Ultimately, for me, I grew tired of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff because, as critically important as that role is, we weren't stopping new cases coming through the door. I never felt that we were making a long term difference. We were just responding to problems. So I decided to join TOP because I see this as a real way of making a difference. And TOP was the only party I could see that were really focused at those underlying issues. Tonight, I'm going to take you through our 4 key policy priorities for the year. But before I get there, ultimately, where we're focused is really on these huge societal issues. Because what we've seen is rising inequality, housing unaffordability, child poverty, these huge issues that have been getting worse steadily for 30 years. And we still have not even seen the full extent of what this economic fallout from COVID might look like when all these stopgap, quick fix wage subsidy schemes run out. And again, we heard today that our finance minister acknowledged that these are not sustainable long-term financial support options and that they need to find something more sustainable into the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later tonight. Ultimately, our policies, TOP's policies, were designed by experts and economists, people whose careers are focused on finding solutions to the country's problems. And they have had those solutions thrown in the too hard basket by politicians. We pride ourselves so much on being a nation of innovators, and we think of ourselves as leading the world in so many areas. We hear politicians talk about this wonderful world that we live in, and we're all about fairness and equality of opportunity. There's just one problem with that. It is a myth. Because the New Zealand we live in right now does not have equality of opportunity. Because not everybody has the same starting point in life. And we need to change that. But to do that, we have to first acknowledge what our reality is. And for most of us, that's a bit of a mind shift because a lot of us don't think of New Zealand as having these huge issues. We think about this fair go that everybody has, and we tell ourselves that's the case, but it's not. And I can tell you, working in the justice system, you just see how glaringly obvious that really is. And then we have millennials who look to be the first generation who'll be worse off than their parents. And then we want them to sort out, my generation, sort out the climate crisis, our environmental crisis, housing crisis. And we wonder why we have some of the worst mental health statistics in the Western world. We need to start addressing these problems. So I hope you can see the presentation now. Joe can just let me know if there's any issues with it. But I'll take you through our key policy priorities in a moment. Ultimately, you might have seen by now, but our message this year is simple. Don't leave change to chance. Vote top. Because unless you really vote for change, you're just going to keep on getting the same old that we've had for 30 years. Okay, so I'll move on now and we'll go through, Joe, if you want to take us through to the next slide. So these are our priorities this year. Affordable housing and rent, universal basic income, UBI, smart small business, and a climate-friendly recovery. So we'll start with affordable housing and rent. Just wait for that to tick over. Thanks. Right, I'm sure many of you have heard from Jeff, our leader, he's an economist, multiple times, just how much of a hot mess our housing market really is. And we cannot ignore it any longer. The first graph of the evening, I'll show you. This is New Zealand's story. This is the story of rents and house prices rising faster than incomes for 30 years. And it's been the same, as you can see, whether Labour's been in charge or National. This is New Zealand's story of its rising inequality. Housing is the reason the rich are getting richer and the poor are struggling harder each and every year. We have told ourselves that buying and selling property to each other is a great idea. But as you can see from Germany, right down the bottom, they've had relatively flat property housing costs for the last 30 to 40 years. Because Germany knows that buying and selling houses to each other does not create jobs or exports, and actually has nothing to do with the strength of an economy or its ability to grow. We need to deal with this. We've spoken so much with COVID about the need to flatten the curve. This is the next curve we need to flatten. Because if we really want to deal with these systemic issues in society, all roads lead to housing. We need to keep house prices steady for a generation to allow time for incomes to catch up. We also need to stop calling our housing market a ladder. If it ever was, it's definitely a pyramid now, because it is a direct wealth transfer from the younger generations and those just entering the market to either the older generations or those who've been there for a while. It is a direct transfer of wealth. And that is not how New Zealand should be. So, there are a number of reasons why this is a problem, and I'm going to show you another graph to show you one of them, and it's our tax system. Now, it's no secret I'm not the economist, but I can tell you this is Jeff's favourite piece of information to come out of the tax working group. Fun fact, New Zealand has some of the highest tax on other investments in the world, things like our bank deposits, our businesses, and KiwiSaver, for example. But we have some of the lowest taxes on housing in the world. And hopefully you can see that. I know it's really small, but that tiny red graph there, that is owner-occupied housing. And it is the different tax treatments of all those other kinds of investments compared to housing that drives everybody into the investment that is not taxed, into housing. And that pushes up demand, pushes up prices, speculators jump on, and we know how that story ends. It's no wonder when you look at this piece of information that we put more of our money into housing than any other country. It is a huge hole in our tax system. And it's also part of the story of why some businesses are struggling to get access to the capital that they need to grow. And what is so frustrating about this piece of information is that it's not a secret. Bill English knew about it, Jacinda knows about it, Winston definitely knows about it, but none of them have the courage to have a sensible conversation about this because it is not going to buy votes. But if we're serious about dealing with this huge issue in our society, we need to start talking about it. So, TOP will fix this problem on a number of fronts. The first is dealing with that differential. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You can either lower the taxes on all those other kinds of investments to balance it out. You'd have to figure out where you get the money from, or you raise the tax on property, or maybe a little bit of both. The point is you need to balance it out. So TOP will tax housing the same as all other assets. Secondly, now we know from experience that immigration can be incredible for a country for so many different reasons. We just need to make sure that housing and infrastructure can keep up because for the last decade that has not been the case. So we need to manage immigration. Third, we need to encourage quality, affordable apartments and terraced housing around public and active transport networks in cities. Encourage this medium density around these transport networks that will deal with the supply issues within city limits and also reduce our impact on the climate with reducing our emissions. Now, I'm in Auckland. I don't know if everybody tuning in where you're from, but we have had over the last decade this huge, we've always been quite a sprawling city, but even more sprawl has happened in the last decade, and we have lost key agricultural land around our city limits that we will never get back. Land that created jobs and exports is gone for housing. We need to deal with that, and we don't want other cities around the country to fall in that same problem. And the last one here, as I said, we need to flatten the curve, but it's going to take a generation for incomes to start to catch up and to close that unaffordability gap. In the meantime, renters need to be able to turn their houses into homes and have that real security of tenure. Because for over 50 years now, we have seen home ownership rates decline, and that only looks to be continuing. So this group of renters is going to increase. Ultimately, for TOP, we think that housing as shelter should be a fundamental human right. Kiwis need to stop thinking about housing as a get-rich-quick scheme. So that's TOP's policies on housing. Next up is our universal basic income. Now, a UBI is a simple idea, but it takes a bit to get your head around, and different people have very different gut reactions to this policy. And there are very different reasons why people who are typically right like it and people of the left like it. But it achieves very different policy objectives, and that is why it's probably as apolitical as a policy can get. So I'll start with our current system. And I know it might be coming up a little bit small, so I'll explain it to you. But this graph is New Zealand's welfare trap. Up the left, you see the money, the take-home pay a person gets, and along the bottom is the amount of working hours they do in a week. So this is an example of somebody who's on the job seeker benefit, they're 25 and over, they're single, no children, and they're in a minimum wage job. Now, as you can see, when they work just up to about 5 hours, they keep most of what they earn. But if they decide to work between 5 and 25 hours, which is going to be a significant portion of the workforce because part-time offerings is only going to be increasing in this uncertain time, for those people, they will only end up keeping between $2 and $4 an hour. It's just not worth it. And that is the welfare trap. And just as an aside, I don't know if who's watching has paid attention to the Greens guaranteed minimum income policy, which does some good things. So it gives more money to our lowest income people. That's great. The problem with it, though, is that this welfare trap that you can see gets pushed out all the way to 36 hours before they start earning keeping what they earn. That does away with part-time work completely because they would end up keeping about $3 an hour if they're working for between 10 and 36 hours a week, which is just crazy. And I'm sure there's no one watching who thinks that's acceptable, right? So, what is this UBI all about? For top, it's $250 a week for every adult, $40 for every child. No conditions and no wins. You might ask yourself, what would you do if tomorrow you had $250 a week? You might choose to retrain or start a business or spend more time with your family. The point is, it would be your choice and your decision because fundamentally at top, we trust our fellow Kiwis to spend the money in the way that they need to, in a way that makes sense for them. Kiwis need to have the freedom to pursue their goals. And that's a huge reason for why we want a UBI. And this has been trialled overseas, and I'm happy to go into some examples, but there is no evidence, first of all, that everybody just stops working and spends all their money on cigarettes and alcohol, because that is not what is borne out in the evidence. What we've actually seen in trials is either no change or a slight increase in working days or a decrease for two specific groups of society in working days. The first are people who have gone off to either stay in school longer or retrain. And the second group are predominantly mothers, but parents who have chosen to spend more time with children. Those are the only two groups we've seen so far where working days have decreased. But I'm sure you can probably understand why that would be, and it probably makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, our current welfare system is completely failing us. As I showed you with that welfare trap, it works in the opposite way that we expect it to. We expect it to incentivize work and support Kiwis as they move out of welfare into the job market, right? So, why have we kept going with a system that is actually holding Kiwis back? So, I'll carry on. So, that was the current system, and this is what it looks like with the UBI. That blue line is the UBI. And that is what it looks like with TOP's UBI and flat tax of 33%. Every single hour you work, you keep. There is no welfare trap at all. So the real winners from the UBI, well, I think everyone wins from the UBI, but the real winners here are the working poor. Those on the minimum wage are taken over and above the living wage, which just quickly, by the way, the single biggest driver of what pushes up the cost of living each and every year is housing. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that we would put those costs on businesses when businesses are not responsible for our absolute mess of a housing problem. Instead, we achieve that same objective because, of course, at top, we want everybody to have enough to live on. But we're not putting that pressure on, that burden on businesses, especially at a time like now when uncertainty is only going to continue to rise. So it really is a huge win for the working poor. But as you can see there, all wage and salary earners will still end up being better off cash in hand at the end of the day. It's just that the benefits really are stacked at that bottom end. Because when you have a UBI and a flat tax combined, it ends up being a more progressive tax system than we have currently. The other thing I just wanted to touch on before I move on, and the reason why it says beneficiaries no change is because so the UBI, the 250, is the first 250 of any benefit that anyone is currently receiving. But there will be, and there is people who are receiving more than that, and they will continue to be topped up to that level. So the UBI is the floor, it is not a ceiling. So any beneficiaries, especially those, for example, on the sickness benefit, And there are Kiwis who just won't be able to work and they need to continue to be receiving the same financial support that they're getting now. So the only other last thing I just wanted to mention just on this slide is, we've seen this huge disruption with COVID, but there is another huge wave of disruptions in the job market coming. And that's with the rise of artificial intelligence and automation. And it's going to mean that we're going to have to retrain, and people will be going in and out of work far more regularly than we've ever seen before. Our current welfare system is so heavily bureaucratic and expensive and slow, with huge stand down periods, and it does not have the ability to be flexible enough to adapt to people's constant changing circumstances as they move in and out of work. With the UBI, you always have that basic level of financial support, no matter what your financial circumstances are otherwise. And then I'll just go on to the next. Yep, thanks, Joe. So what will this cost? Because I know there's lots of questions around this. So it is fully costed. And just on that, we're not printing money to pay for this. So that's important to note. It is self-funding. A huge part of this, you can see, is paid for by our flat tax of 33%. That's $20 billion, we estimate. $8 billion comes from a number of things, significantly savings from getting rid of a lot of the bureaucracy in our current system, working for families, for example, which, by the way, working for families has got to be the biggest white flag that our system and society is failing, that we have working families who still struggle to pay for their basic needs, their rent, their mortgage, their food, their bills. I'll leave that one there. For us, this is what a modern, simple, and fair system will look like. The only other thing I was just going to say on the bureaucracy thing, if anyone has paid attention to anything coming out of ACT in the last little while, their welfare approach would increase government spending on bureaucracy because it would be far more punitive than the current system, far more bureaucratic. And I haven't even got on to talking about the stigma and the stress and anxiety induced for people who have to deal with WINs already. So all those issues would only get a whole lot worse under ACT's welfare proposal. And I'll just move on. So the last one there is dynamic benefits. Sorry, Joe, just one last point there. So the last one there is dynamic benefits, the other $8 billion. So that's based on modelling from the results that we've seen from trials overseas. So we've seen people retrain, and so they go into higher paying jobs and contribute more to tax. We've seen hospitalisation rates fall by 8.5%. And one of the most significant results was actually in the Finnish trial, where they saw depression rates reduce by a third in the UBI trial group. Significant. So ultimately, we have this potential for these huge benefits we estimate between 8 and 10 billion. But if they weren't to come through, we can pay for it with our property tax that I've already covered. Ultimately, our system is fundamentally not working. Why would we keep going with a system that's broken? Now is the time to start something new, something that has been shown to work overseas. We can't afford not to do this. So that is our UBI. Okay. Smart small business. I need to go a bit quicker and see the time. Okay. So look, typically Labour has been the party for unions and National has been the party for big business. But for a long time, there hasn't been a voice for small businesses. And there's nearly 500,000 of them in New Zealand. They really are the backbone of our economy. And they deserve better support. Other than that, on a more personal level, almost half of our candidates are either currently or have previously been small business owners. So our team really gets how important small businesses are and the support that they need. And you'll see the theme in this policy and the next one is a real focus on ensuring that we can have economic growth and also reducing our harm on the environment. So what is our proposal? So I've already mentioned the UBI. Now that provides a huge financial support base for people who are just about to start up a business and they have that little safety net, basically, to help them at the beginning. So, top will abolish provisional tax. It is punitive. It requires a lot of guesswork, and it places a huge burden on our small businesses. Instead, we'll just abolish the provisional tax collection model. Companies can pay their annual tax based on actual taxable income for the previous year. We also want to remove fringe benefit tax from low emissions vehicles. Now, you may not know this, but we all currently subsidise double cab utes. They're not very good for the environment. So we want to make sure that businesses still retain the benefit of uh, not having fringe benefit tax payable on certain vehicles. So let's ensure those are on low emissions vehicles, because companies buy them new, then they circle through the market, and us Kiwis get to buy them secondhand, and that increases the market of these secondhand low emissions vehicles that we desperately need. Excuse me, one second. Sorry about that. So that is our focus there. We just want to do two birds, one stone, ensure that there continues to be that benefit for our businesses, but in the right places moving forward for the 21st century. We also want to provide grants of $10,000 for businesses to make better use of digital technologies and to improve their energy and resource efficiency. And that focus there is all about ensuring that these businesses are sustainable into the future, that their practices and their business model is sustainable going forward through all the different changes of circumstances that we're going to be seeing. So it's a win-win for the environment and also for their business bottom line. We need to rein in big business and look to bring in better competition laws that makes the market fairer. We need to make sure that big business and the government are paying their bills on time because they can afford to, and getting cash to our small businesses faster is essential. We also want to do things like encouraging networking that are just where the bureaucrats and politicians get out of the way. Businesses know what they need. We don't need to tell them. We also need to make sure that research and education and training are more responsive to the needs of businesses. And so part of that is making vocational education have the proper recognition that it needs. And the last point is about encouraging productive investment. That red graph right at the beginning, for anyone who's just tuning in now, I actually have it here. I don't know if you can see that. This is the graph. By dealing with that huge tax hole and leveling out these ones, anyone who's just tuning in, go back and watch the start. But by balancing that out, we need to encourage Kiwis to invest in businesses to help them grow and develop, to create jobs and exports. So top really is the party for small business. And moving on to our last policy focus is climate-friendly recovery. So again, we can have businesses be part of the solution and not seen as part of the problem. That is the real progress that is possible with TOP's plan. So we've talked about making businesses more energy efficient. Yeah, just next one there, Joe. Thank you. So we also want to make our households more energy efficient as well. That's a win-win for the environment and families' back pockets. We need to plant erosion-prone land in native trees, but we're not talking about blanketing our whole country in pine trees, because our climate crisis is not a problem that we can just plant our way out of. It actually is important that we change business practices and not just constantly offset their behaviour. So I'll come back to infrastructure, but a part of that is increasing the price of carbon each and every year. And TOP says we need to start by doubling it from where it is currently. Because you get to a tipping point where the cost of paying for carbon gets so high that it's cheaper for businesses to move to lower emissions, cleaner business practices. And that's the tipping point that we really need to get to. And our infrastructure. Now, we actually have 4 extra weeks for the election, so that's 9 more weeks to hear other parties try and buy your vote. You will never hear Top come along and declare that we're going to build that bridge and we're going to build a bridge from Wellington to Nelson or anywhere else. Because ultimately, these infrastructure decisions, and we are going to be seeing some of the biggest infrastructure spending of my lifetime, how that money is spent should not be used as a way to buy your vote. We have the NCTA was set up as in part to be this independent body to ensure that politicians aren't just using these infrastructure projects as ways to buy votes. And yet here we are. We have some parties who thinks, it's okay and it's enough to campaign on roads. Well, it's not. It's not enough. And these decisions need to be transparent. Everyone needs to be able to determine what are their social, cultural, economic, and environmental impacts. What is the business case and can it be justified? Because, like I said, these are huge decisions and they need to be ready for the 21st century, not the 20th. It's a huge opportunity for us to future proof our economy and how our country is built so that we actually are building back better than we were before. It's really about what kind of future do we want. But again, these need to be transparent decisions. It's a huge opportunity for us going forward. And, do you want to keep going to the next slide, Joe? So, you have heard from me as to TOP's policy priorities this year. But ultimately, the question is for you. What kind of future do you want for New Zealand? Do you want more of the same old, same old? Because we've seen what it looks like. We've had it for 30 years. Then you can vote for the same old, same old. But if you want real change, listening to the experts on how we can address these systemic issues, then it's about voting for something different. So if you feel motivated, that you are also passionate and you really want to help, there are so many things that you can do to help us. So thanks, Joe. Yeah. So join us, volunteer, donate. We are going to have to be launching a whole nother fundraising campaign because we didn't premonition that we would have to be campaigning for another 4 weeks. And so that will be something that we have to plan about hugely. And yeah, and part of our campaign is going to be telling people's stories because it's probably no secret at TOP we could have academic debates all night long. But at the end of the day, every single policy decision affects real life people each and every day. So it's your stories that matter most. And so that is what you will start seeing as we get closer to the election, although, again, it is 9 weeks away now. And I think, is that the last slide there, Joe? Yeah, okay, cool. I know everyone has a very different idea of what change looks like. For me personally, it's about the outcomes. Because I think there are a lot of political parties who have great aspirations and great vision and also want this country to be better. But what's the point of hopes and good intentions if the outcomes don't change? And to me, that's huge because as I showed you in that very first graph right at the start, it hasn't actually made a difference what colour's been in government because the policies haven't changed. With TOP, you don't have that. You have completely new modern policies to address those issues. So that is where we stand. I will take some questions if there are any. I'll start with the Zoom people in our Zoom room and then I'll have any others fed through to me and we'll see if how this works.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that, Shai. So what we're going to do really quickly is we'll give you a second if you need to get a glass of water or anything, and we will.
For my tea.
or a nice glass of tea. That's cool. So what we'll do is I'll read out some of the questions. If anybody is in the Zoom group chat and you want to ask anything, please feel free to put that in there. Hit the button to raise your hand or anything along those lines, and we can give you the opportunity to ask a question. Again, keep in mind those questions won't have your video going through to the live stream, so that's totally cool. Or otherwise, if you are watching this on any of our social channels, please feel free to leave a comment down below. We do have our team in there responding to you as well, and we're happy to pass those on to Shai. So we'll start off with the first question here from Maria. What does a universal basic income for Māori look like? As research shows that universal anything doesn't benefit tangata whenua, as most times this is based on a Western lens.
A couple of things with that. What we have seen with the current targeted system, which does listen to that idea that you can't treat everyone the same and different people need more support, right? The problem that we have seen with this targeted model and any model that comes with some conditioning is that people in need inevitably miss out. And we see that in families where relationships where the partner, and this is often male dominated partners, are the ones earning too much money, and the women become dependent and stuck in those relationships where for the wrong reasons, because that is their source of income. Because our welfare system treats a couple as if you are one economic unit. There is no individualization of our current welfare system. So if conditioning doesn't work, we need to try something different. And this means that every single member of a household, every single adult, whether there are 2 people in the house or 6, everyone gets that 250, which is not the current state of play at the moment. So everyone is treated as their own individual.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Thank you. So our second question from Matt from our social media here is, with the additional money in the pocket of the poor, what is to stop the wealthy from realizing that there is an additional pool of money for rent, for example, as we saw what happened with the increase that went to students and the likes, or for money for electricity, etc. As people gain more money, the wealthy will realize they can pay for more things. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really fair question, and we saw that with the accommodation supplement for students. What we saw was just the increase in rents by about $50 a week. So it's a really fair question, and there are a few things to deal with that. The first is renters' rights. So a lot of the times we've seen renting prices go up when the contract changes. So either that's because in some cases it is just because the landlord wants to sell the property to get a tax-free capital gain, but sometimes it is because they want to sign up a new group of tenants in that property at a higher rate. So with our proposal for better rights for tenants, for renters' rights, it's just that security of tenure, so that it is more difficult to just up the rent out of nowhere, not quite out of nowhere, but in the way that they can at the moment. Just to provide that better security so that we don't have these costs going straight up to landlords.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so third question here from Dave. In the justice space, what are your thoughts on the 3-strike system championed by the ACT Party?
I love this question. So I actually studied this a bit a few years ago as part of my master's degree, because I was working in it and dealing with it, but I didn't have a chance when you're a prosecutor to just deal with the law, and didn't have a chance to look into the evidence of it. So there's a few things. When it was brought into law, there was no evidence behind it that showed that it achieved lower recidivism rates. So that's an important starting point. It didn't come along, it wasn't a policy that came along with that evidence backing it. It was then falls into the populist approach, because populist policies care more about the policy than the outcomes. What we haven't seen as yet is evidence that shows, now that we've had it in place for some 7 years, I think now, we haven't seen evidence coming forward that it overall reduces our recidivism rate. So if it's not achieving that purpose, we really need to relook at it. And it has created a whole lot of issues in the system. We recently had a case, I think only a month ago, if that, where a man who got his 3rd strike warning and third strike, so you are in prison for the full length of the maximum term of that charge. He was charged with indecent assault for, I think from memory, kissing a woman on the cheek, which ordinarily would get a non-custodial sentence attached to that level of offending, to the level of seriousness. But that person had to go to prison for the full length of that, which I think is, I could be wrong, but I think it's a 7-year term from memory. So that's a consequence of this current model. And if it's not achieving reducing recidivism, why are we keeping it?
That's impressive. Okay, we've got a question here as well from Sean. Why is it important to refer to UBI as a dividend rather than as a benefit?
It's a great question. It's just another way to look at it, right? Because if we think about the tax pool as all of us contributing to New Zealand Inc., if it was a company, we would just, as shareholders, get our dividends. So it's just another way of thinking about it, because that's effectively what it is. You might have, just as an aside, you might have heard of Andrew Yang. He was a Democratic presidential candidate running uh, this time around in the States, running for president, and he campaigned predominantly on a UBI, but for him, he called it the freedom dividend. And it's the same thing, and it's the same idea that we're just getting back a bit of what we've put into the system. Which actually, I forgot to mention this earlier, with the UBI, what it effectively creates is a tax-free threshold at $39,000 a year, because the amount of tax and UBI cancel each other out. I forgot to mention that earlier.
Nice, I love it. That's fantastic. A question here from David. What is TOP's policy on the minimum wage, be it abolishing, be it lowering, or keeping it? And if there is a UBI, more importantly, why?
We don't have a policy to change minimum wage, to lower it, we definitely do not have a policy to lower minimum wage. The focus of the UBI is to effectively turn those working minimum wage jobs into people who are receiving the living wage. And it goes back to what I was trying to explain earlier, is that is not a burden we should be placing on businesses, especially at a time when they're going to be struggling the hardest, because the costs of living come down to our housing problem. So, yeah, I forgot the second part of your question, sorry.
Yeah, no, that basically answers it there.
Okay.
Perhaps then what we'll do is we'll finish this off with one last question here from George. Which specific property taxes would be used to fund a UBI?
So TOP's property tax works like this. So if you had $1 million and you put that, and it was cash, and you put it in the bank, you get interest, you pay tax on that interest. So our property tax treats equity in your home, in your property, as if it was that cash in the bank. And so it works out to be tax, an annual tax of 1% on the value of your equity.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for answering that. What we'll do is we'll wrap it up here. Thank you to everybody who's joined us specifically in the Zoom chat, as well as on all of our social media channels. Really appreciate you checking in here. Shai, do you want to close the event out then? Say anything more?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone so much for taking the time to be here this evening. I know it's not the event that we planned. We were going to have this beautiful event at the Grange, which is this beautiful venue, by the way. They haven't asked me to say that. They probably don't even know that I was going to have the event there. Well, they gave us permission, but it's just beautiful, and it's such a shame that we couldn't be there and support businesses here on the North Shore or in Auckland at all. So really looking forward to getting to level 2 so we can get back and supporting the community again in that way. But just genuinely, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to listen to TOP's ideas for our future. And I hope you are all staying safe out there.